Smashing. Great. I'm being told by an American voice that recording's in progress. This is from Moodle. I'm sure you've seen it. Gospel of Mark today, Matthew, Luke, John successively, and then the fifth week will be back to Luke, because that's what you're going to be doing your assignment on, because that's the it's in the lectionary for this year. And we'll focus both a bit more on some of Luke's texts, I think parables probably, and your essays, where we'll think about the structure and resourcing for that. You then have 2 weeks not on this module. I'm sure you're doing other things apart from perhaps talking to me about your assignment. And then on the 3rd of November, I kickstart the second half of the module on Paul, and Andrew Rudd takes over and looks after the rest of those sessions and the second form of assessment. So first 4 weeks, we've got to get to grips with what did the Gospels mean in the earliest context that we know about. That's to say, the people for whom they were written. And that's an implied reader, because we don't actually, know about Mark's community, Mark's congregation or congregations. In the fifth week, we then have to consider what we do with all the kind of analysis and exegesis we've been doing when we preach in new contexts. The module is called Writings of the New Testament in Context. I guess that should be contexts, really, because we need to think about how you move from one to another. Expectations. I hope you've reread Mark. It's short enough to do at one sitting, but you might have broken it up. The others are longer, and I will in each case suggest chunks which make a rational way of sort of reading it in chunks if one sitting is too long for you. Hope you've read Cook. I like Richard Cook's stuff. I hadn't read it before. I don't think you'll find that we are contradicting each other very much, if at all. And certainly he has that approach, which I will often share, of giving you more than one possibility and the reasons for it. I'll use the NRSV unless stated, and I'd expect you to do the same. But in some of the search tools that we'll be looking at, they're using other versions. That's fine for search tools, as long as we, then go back to the NRSV and quote it in that. Don't think you have to take a lot of notes now. I hope that you'll tell me about that at a later stage. This is where I want to start. Just suppose, and I'd be very rich and famous, I've discovered a fragment of a 1st century manuscript, and it says, but in Greek, to Lydia from Mark, and we are assuming that this is Mark is the person who wrote this gospel, and he's sending greetings to a fellow Christian, may or may not be the Lydia that we've heard about in Acts, and he says, I've just written but the fragmentary nature of the manuscript unfortunately breaks down at that point. So we don't know what he said he's just written. And similarly, he says, what I've tried to do is, and unfortunately, we don't know what he would have said he was trying to do. I've frozen for some reason, that's it. Having said I don't want you to take notes, I hope you've got a pencil and paper with you or something similar. Can you jot down in some way a continuation of those phrases? So the phrases you need is, I have just written a what? And what I have tried to do is, now what would Mark have said he had tried to do in having written what we call Gospel according to Mark? I'm going to come out of that, but I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do it.
Was the second fragment I have tried to?
Yeah, what I have tried to do is...
Yeah.
Some of you look as if you may be going on to write the whole of the gospel. I'm going to have to stop at some point with a few phrases. Can we share some of that? First one, what would you have called it? I've just written, what have you gone for? Nigel, what have you gone for?
I've just written an account of the life and ministry of Jesus.
An account of the life and
Ministry of Jesus.
ministry of Jesus. If he was, what would he have meant by life? How much of the life of Jesus do you get in Mark?
Only about 3 years worth.
It's either 1 year or 3 years. There's only one Passover in Mark. John gives us 3 Passovers, which is quite likely 3 years of ministry. So that's the thing that ministry certainly. An account of the ministry of Jesus. Nice. All right. Anybody else? Tracy, can you tell us what you put for that bit?
I think I was trying to go off the simplicity of having read and reread, and I'm actually doing some preaching on Mark this weekend anyway, so that's strange. But I've just actually put it down as story and about what happened, because to me it's very simplistic and very straightforward, and it's telling you a story. So I just put that.
A lot of people say it's got the sense of a not that he is an eyewitness, but that it feels like the eyewitness of one person in some ways. I think there's a simplicity about narrative. I think in some ways it's immensely sophisticated in terms of its theology and so forth. But certainly Mark is a stonkingly good storyteller, quite pacey, quite dramatic. Lots of those storytellers' tricks, if you like, or the rhetoric of leaving you with a cliff edge, and what are you going to do with that? That sort of storytelling, which of course is very sophisticated, though it seems.
It's interesting to preach from because of that. Very interesting.
He must have, I think he'd have been a great street preacher if he ever did that. I don't know. Anybody got something radically different from an account of the ministry or stories about?
I put a summary of all I've heard about the life of Jesus.
Yeah, again, life of Jesus would need to sort of do something. When you say ministry, what's the last third all about?
It's his death.
Yeah, so people used to say, it's not entirely true, but you can see what they mean. The Gospel according to Mark is a passion narrative with a very extended introduction. You know, Jesus is going to die. Certainly from 3:6, they conspired how they would destroy him. Arguably from 1:14, Mark says Jesus came preaching after John had been arrested. Well, John was killed. You know, you kind of the whole build, and of course a large portion is given over to the narrative of narratives of the Passion. Good, and the fact that we now call it Gospel according to Mark is an editorial thing, actually largely inspired by his first line. This is the beginning of the good news, the gospel. Gospel's just Anglo-Saxon for good news. And it probably is because he started it that way. That's why we call it that. What he meant was, this is the beginning of the proclamation about Jesus, the good news proclamation. It wasn't the name of the book then. Now, slightly more penetrating or detailed, how did anybody get on with the next bit? Can I choose people? Susan, what did you do for the next bit? What I have tried to do is,
I've said, what I have tried to do is tell of all the wonderful things he did for mankind, his ministry mission, and his ultimate and tragic death.
One would have to change ultimate to something like penultimate, wouldn't they? Because it's the death that leads to, you know, and you know, the tragedy turns to something to glory, doesn't
Obvious,
it?
yeah.
But it certainly is really downbeat. The one thing Jesus says from the cross in Mark's version is, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's really, you go through it with Mark. It's a dark journey that he takes you on. Did anybody else have similar, different? What have we got? Any volunteers, or shall I choose? Jill, what did you have?
I put what I tried to do is show Jesus's astonishing teachings, and to show how Jesus's astonishing teachings affected the people and how the disciples react to his actions and death.
That's a really interesting way of putting it, because he shows you what the reactions are for and against of his teaching. He doesn't give you much of his teaching. There's a few parables, there's a few sayings, but you know how Matthew gets together lots of sayings in different blocks, great discourses, John's discourses, all of Luke's stories. Mark's teaching, you could pretty much reduce to a few pages, what he says, that he taught, and with authority, and people followed or opposed. That's exactly what he gets to. So well done. I think that's right too. Got something in chat from Nigel, trying to capture the most important details and scenes from the beginnings of ministry in Galilee, absolutely, to events surrounding his crucifixion in Jerusalem. Yeah. What Nigel's certainly telling us is that it's a selection. And what I shall be quite majoring on today and in the next 4 weeks is it's a selection that must have been relevant to his context. I mean, you don't in a sermon start preaching about things that aren't relevant to the congregation, or you put them in such a way that makes them relevant to your congregation. Cracking. I think we're all going to be singing from the same sheet, which is great. If I do that again, are you looking at that again? And I think I've got just a short summary there of Gospel and Good News. It's a proclamation of victory. The person coming back, riding back to tell people whether their army had succeeded or would be giving the gospel, the euangelion. And we get it twice in the opening of Mark. First of all, he says it. This is the beginning of that proclamation about Jesus. And Jesus has a euangelion. So we've got two meanings, really. It's the good news about Jesus, and Jesus has a euangelion. His gospel is about the kingdom. They are, of course, the same, but Jesus, in a way, proclaimed the kingdom of God. We proclaim Jesus as king. There is a very strong connection, but there is a kind of shift. Here's my agenda for tonight. Started as a preliminary of what we're trying to do, and you're really on to several details of the gospel, which is great. I am going to get on to some of the content, Peter in Mark, and some of the structure and themes, but I want to start with the questions about author, date, and place. Because we want to understand meanings that are accessible to the first readers, we can ask who wrote it, when did they write it, for whom, and why. Not otherwise, especially interested in the purely historical questions. We're looking for author, date, and place insofar as they help us to understand that context of the first network of congregations among whom Mark was living and to whom he was preaching his gospel, reading his gospel. What do we know? There's lots we don't. The text doesn't name the author. Those bits that say the gospel according to are, sort of editorial as part of the publishing of it. The text within the text, it doesn't say, and this is my message to you and my name is. Tradition, early tradition, so by about 300, we learn that they think that it's by somebody called Mark who knew Peter. That's what we call a second generation Christian, not a disciple of Jesus, but a disciple of his disciples. There's a reference to my son Mark in 1 Peter. The claim is often that he's John Mark, because there's a John Mark in Acts, and who is seen to be the same as the Mark who's in Colossians and Philemon. Mark was a very common name, and on the whole, John Mark is associated in Acts with Paul and Barnabas rather than Peter, but that doesn't mean it's not him. The episode where John Mark appears in Acts is fascinating. I don't know if you know it. He's been, Paul is going to set off with Barnabas from Antioch, and Barnabas wants to take John called Mark. This is what's it called? Ayla Sperling's take in the Brick Testament. Irreverent, sometimes quite provocative, but usually quite insightful. You can see the text is fascinating. Paul decided not to take with them one who had deserted them in Pamphylia. He had been part of a mission program and had left. And the disagreement had become so sharp that Barnabas and Paul part company and take up with different mission partners. Fascinating insight. Doesn't tell us anything really about the authorship, but that's who John Mark is. The evidence that we're going to go and pursue is that where those traditions come from, and are they reliable, what do they mean, and internal evidence of the authorship, and that's from the text of Mark. That's when we get into implied readers and the content of the piece. Starting with external, this is Eusebius writing at about 300 in church history, ecclesiastical history, and he says, Mark had been the interpreter or translator of Peter. Now, this is my experiment. I want somebody to unmuffle and shout out, why does Peter need an interpreter?
Because he didn't speak Greek?
Yes, what did he speak?
Aramaic?
Spot on. Aramaic, language of Jesus and of the first disciples, and it's exclusively really limited to Palestine and parts of Syria. So if you're Aramaic speaking, you're from there. Hebrew wasn't spoken except in for reading the scriptures. Aramaic is a separate language from Hebrew, but they are related, both Semitic languages. And Greek was the lingua franca of the whole of the empire. It had been the Greek Empire before it was the Roman Empire. Latin is spoken in Rome and parts of Italy, and as a sort of legal and civil language, sometimes certainly for documentation, but you traded in Greek. Most writing was in Greek, certainly lots of books. And the deal is that Eusebius writes that Papias, and he's somewhere around the early part of the 2nd century, wrote that John the Elder, and we don't know who John the Elder is, there's a number of possibilities, said that Mark had been the interpreter of Peter. So we've got a kind of distance. I put it onto a timeline in case that makes things transparent. There's quite a distance between Eusebius and this first written association of Peter with Peter with Mark's Gospel. John the Elder presumably overlaps somehow with Mark and has passed this on, and he then overlaps in some way with Papias, who writes somewhere 110, 120, maybe later. That could be true, but it also says these traditions are, passed on and might be. He says further that Mark wrote down accurately, but not in order, all that Peter remembered of the Lord's sayings and doings. Now that's crucial for us to understand, and I think some of your accounts that I asked you to make up took account of this. The gospel narratives are a number of remembered things. They don't represent a chronological order of events. Obviously, sometimes they do. You can't have the trial before you've had the arrest, certain things come in a certain order. But when you think of the teachings and the healings and what goes with what and what happened before what, these have to be editorial selections and arrangements, just as they were by Peter when he was preaching and teaching, and when the gospel writers write down the traditions about Jesus. Mark had not heard the Lord nor been a follower of his, so that confirms 2nd generation Christian, but later a follower of Peter, who used to adapt his teaching to the needs. Texts often do this to us. They assume things which they don't then say. we're pretty sure what that means is that Peter used to adapt his teaching to the groups he was teaching, to the people who were hearing him, to the situation or the context that he was addressing. Now that's really important because just as Peter preaches and adapts the material to the occasion, we see the evangelists targeting this material in ways that make sense to the contexts that they're addressing. And the very first time we learn of, you know, what was happening when people were writing the Gospels, that's the account they were given. I have to say that a few verses before Eusebius tells us this, he says, Papias obviously was a man of very little intelligence, as one could tell judging from his sayings. I don't know if that makes you dispirited in the whole business. It doesn't mean he's wrong. I suppose it just, you know, reminds us that traditions are not necessarily reliable. What I think is really strongly positive about this tradition is that from the get-go, we are reminded that the Gospels are translated. We don't have many of Jesus' actual words. If you think about what Mark gives us in Aramaic, Talitha cum, little girl get up, Ephatha, be opened, Abba, and he tells you what they mean too. He's not expecting all his readers to know Aramaic, although if some of them didn't, it would be odd to use the Aramaic at all. But it's not chronological, not first-hand eyewitness, and that this material is adapted and applied for, you know, not just the settings that Jesus addressed it in, but for the new settings that these preachers and evangelists are bringing it to, the new context. That's, I mean, the church at some periods of its history and some forms of biblical interpretation has lost sight of those really important classifications of what sort of thing it is that we are reading. I think it helps, not hinders, and it's there right from the beginning. Turning now from external to internal evidence for authorship, and that's the text of Mark. And there's two things that we traditionally can look at: content and style. I'm going to shelve content for just a bit, because we are going to look at a particular part of the content, asking what does it say about Peter? Does it reflect Peter's particular witness? So that's coming later. The other element of internal evidence is style. How does Mark write? What does that tell us? His Greek is not literary. It's not bad. He's a bright lad. He's not a posh lad. He's not somebody with a Hellenistic education. It's generally agreed that the best Greek in the New Testament is Luke. Luke's got a Hellenistic cultural education and writes as well as historians of the day do in Greek. Mark makes perfectly good sense, but with indications that he's not educated in a particularly literary way. And his language has Semitic features. That's to say, his mother tongue, probably Aramaic, like Jesus, Peter, and all the first disciples in Galilee and Judea. So it's consistent with the author being a Palestinian Jew from Galilee or Judea. John Mark, if it was that Mark, his mother has a house in Jerusalem in Acts. I've put down some random Aramaic there for you, not for any other purpose, but illustrative. What do we mean? It was probably Aramaic. Here's some grammar. Don't know where you are on main verbs and subordinate clauses, but in classical Greek, sentences usually contained a main verb and subordinate clauses. And I've done one. The students, having done their preparation and after sorting Robert out on Zoom technology, began their lesson. Main clause, students began their lesson. The other clauses, the students are still the subject of them. The subordinate clauses done with a different kind of verb. Now, used to be good English too. Mark's sentences don't do that. What they do is actually very familiar to you. The posh name for it is parataxis, which means putting the syntax beside clauses beside each other in parallel, because he uses and so does a great deal of the Hebrew Bible. You know the style from a lot of English translations, especially the more traditional ones, and especially King James. And God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from darkness, etc. Parataxis, clause after clause, linked with and, makes perfectly good sense. It's perfectly, as it were, literary Hebrew, just happens not to be the way that the Greek of the day was composed in the 1st century. So we can say that Mark is kind of probably thinking in Aramaic and writing in Greek. See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over, and they will condemn him. At this point, the NRSV thinks this is dreadful and leaves out the and, puts in then. They will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they leave that one out. They put in a semicolon. You don't get sort of punctuation, well, very much at all in the Greek manuscripts. So they're putting it in to make it slightly more acceptable posh English. Fascinatingly, Mark can do it if he wants to. Once, one sentence in the whole of the Gospel, he goes for proper old main clause and subordinate clauses. A certain woman touched his garment. 2 subordinate clauses. Who had hemorrhages when she heard about Jesus? He can do it. That's what your posh boys write at the time. He still put some parataxis in as well. And if you can see, and had suffered and had spent. You know, he's not going to go mad on this style. He can do it. He doesn't, in a way, need to. He is writing very expressively and coherently without that literary genre. I absolutely don't want you to get the impression that Mark's not a good writer. He's simply not, if you like, a literary one. A bright lad, not necessarily a posh one. So internal evidence, that's one among the things that one can do with a style. I thought you'd find it interesting enough to see that example of what people are discussing when they say the style. External evidence. External evidence for date. Whoever the author was, when are they writing? Well, 2nd century sources using that Papias idea about it's Mark, or somebody called Mark. Clement and Irenaeus say in the 2nd century that Mark wrote sometime after Peter's death, and we date Peter's death to 64 CE or thereabouts. There's another form of external evidence. The other Gospels are external evidence as far as Mark's concerned. They're 1st century sources, and we think that they're late 70s or maybe 80s. Those aren't really consensus dates, but somewhere around there. The point is, they use Mark as a source. Almost everybody thinks so. So Mark is earlier than they are. So we've got a date from the tradition that says it's after 64. And we've got a date from our understanding of Mark being used by these publications. So it means it's before the late 70s. We've got quite a sort of a window, a short window there. Internal evidence for, this is where we think about the context of the material, and the phrase that people use for it is the implied readers. Who does he seem to be writing to? What experiences do they have if he's addressing this material to them? And some of the constructs are, it seems to be a community or communities who have embraced the Gentile mission. We'll look at an example in a second. Been affected by persecution, and quite an important date, lived through the Jewish revolt. In 64 to 70, there was a Jewish rebellion against the Roman occupation and a siege of Jerusalem. It ends in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple. The Wailing Wall of the Jerusalem Temple is the only part of the Second Temple that still stands today. And in 70 CE, a major dispersion of Jews from Jerusalem and indeed Judea including, of course, Jews who owned Jesus to be Messiah, so Christian Jews. If there was a community in Judea or even Galilee, they probably left somewhere in the 6s or from 70 CE. So we see these, the possibilities are that this is a community for whom Mark targets material to the new situation. He's addressing issues relevant to his contemporaries and using the material in such a way that choosing it and arranging it and perhaps, editing it to a degree that makes it relevant, just as Peter did, as we learned in his preaching. The kind of example that we've got, that they had embraced the Gentile mission, there's some teaching in Mark 7 where the Pharisees have challenged his disciples for not washing their hands before a meal, which isn't about hygiene, it's about proper conduct, maintaining the law, the Torah. And Mark comments, editorializes what Jesus says. Jesus says, whatever goes into a person from outside doesn't defile them. Thus, says Mark, Jesus declared all foods clean, all foods kosher. So we know that Mark is addressing a mixed Jew-Gentile congregation where they are definitely sharing fellowship together. And although Jews may be, the Jewish Christians, the Christian Jews may be Torah observant in all sorts of ways, table fellowship and kosher food is one thing that has changed for them in the Gentile, in acceptance of Gentile mission. So it has to be that kind of
Robert, can I
community.
just ask?
Yes, please. Who is that, Kat?
Yeah, hi, it's me. So one of the things that struck me when I was reading that again is it did remind me of the Acts story where Peter has the vision of the sheep coming down, and because the wording about it's not what it's what, nothing that goes in you is unclean. Yeah. Would that actually strengthen the idea of Mark being a translator of Peter's?
It may, except that you'd have thought that if Peter had understood what Mark understands here, when Jesus said it, he wouldn't have needed that whole Cornelius revelation. The odd thing is, if that's what Jesus meant and they knew it, why on earth didn't they accept Gentiles much earlier? Why is there that kind of where the Jerusalem church has to go through? So it's interesting. It may reflect that Mark is, as it were, looking back on that and saying, now we can see that teaching of Jesus leads us to that same conclusion. Yeah. And I guess they both show the way in which the church evolved to that point. It maybe took the Jerusalem church longer than it did Paul's mission. That's something we will look at next week a bit. Thank you. Very relevant. And it's one of the things that I thought, should I say that or should I leave it out when I was putting this material together? So somebody taught you terribly well in the past. I can see that. Now then, persecution. The central part where Jesus says, if you want to be my followers, they must take up their cross and follow me, lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel. Crucifixion is particularly in this period an execution method of Rome, of the Roman occupation, and it is used not for any particular criminal, it's used for treason. So Jesus is crucified and the charge on the cross is King of the Jews, because that's an assault against the power of the emperor and of the empire. Now, if they are going to take up their cross and lose their life, it looks like these are people for whom the idea of crucifixion by the Romans is a real thing, for their loyalty to the gospel. I'll say a little bit more about that just in a moment. And in terms of the Jewish revolt, we wonder if in chapter 13, although Jesus is saying these things before the late 60s, in about early 30s, Mark's readers are reading them during or after the late 60s. And Mark is, as it were, saying to them, this is what Jesus said. Look, now you know what he means. Nation will rise against nation. There will be famines. There was certainly famine during the siege of Jerusalem. He is possibly targeting this material to them, knowing that they will see what events to recognize in what Jesus said. And this is fascinatingly the case in this following passage. When you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee. We don't know what Jesus meant. What was Jesus' prophecy about? We can make some fairly intelligent guesses that something was erected in on the Temple Mount, perhaps in the Holy of Holies, and that would possibly account for this abomination. But what I want you to see is that that's Mark editorializing and saying, let the reader understand. If I'd been on the NRSV committee agreeing the translation, I would have insisted on changing the inverted commas there, just like we have in when Mark says, thus he declared all foods clean. I think the NRSV's very kind of conservative understanding is that Jesus says, let the reader understand, which is barking, isn't it? He's talking to some disciples who aren't reading at all. This is Mark saying, now when Jesus said that to them, you, like the reader now, understand what that was that he was referring to. Huge irony. We don't. We don't know exactly, but he's saying now you know what he meant. And that, for lots of people, says, surely he is referring to something that they knew that was happening in the 60s in the siege of Jerusalem. So these historical events are presented in a way that makes sense to the evangelist congregation. And he's not making them up. He's editing them in such a way that is relevant to them. And, you know, arguably understanding that context of the first convergence helps us to understand the message that we're going to use. In terms of dating, usually dated then 66 to 73, there's a few variations of that, but there's quite a strong consensus. There isn't for any of the others, but there is for this one. Just before or just after 70 CE, probably. And it clearly or surely impacts on Mark's message. So his eschatology, his teaching of the fulfillment of God's promises in bringing all things to a conclusion, to their divinely appointed end. There's an urgency and an immediacy in Mark's way of putting Jesus' teaching. The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God has come near. A very good commentator called Eugene Boring says, has come near means it's so close that its effects are already evident. And the difficult perhaps verse in 9:1, there are some standing here, Jesus says, who will not taste death. They won't die until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power. Now, he might mean a number of things. People say, well, resurrection or the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. He may have meant all sorts of things. Regardless of what he meant, when Mark writes that to his readers, the plain sense of that is that they would assume that Mark meant, and he may have meant, the fulfillment of God's promises in bringing in the kingdom will happen in the lifetime of the people who were there, which would make it enormously urgent for them because they're sort of second generation and the first generation are beginning to die. So that could be part of that urgency. One of Mark's most favorite words, certainly in chapter 1 and throughout, is immediately. Yes.
I just wanted to interrupt, and you're in full flow, and I hate to do that.
I'm very, very happy that you do.
Yeah. You seem to have placed we've talked about the time when the gospel was created, written, put together. Have we actually discussed the place?
Next on my list.
Oh, next on your list. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're on the same wavelength, which is brilliant. Distinctive nature of discipleship in Mark, or the emphasis on the nature of discipleship in Mark's gospel, that they should deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. As I say, Roman execution, he's surely writing for people for whom that's a reality. And the fascinating thing when we compare it with a later gospel and with a different context is that Luke uses the same teaching of Jesus, but the way he puts it for his readers is different. If anyone want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up the cross daily and follow me. That's not crucifixion by the Romans. That is the self-sacrifice that's involved in daily life. It's become ethical. And thank goodness, and that is surely part of Jesus' teaching too. But can you see how that's Luke is writing into a different context from Mark's, possibly. They both redacted that material accordingly. Nigel wants me to get onto place, and I could do external, internal a bit, although it's a bit vague. The 2nd century traditions that Mark wrote the gospel in Rome, and consequently is the persecution under Nero. Is that what we're dealing with? There is a Coptic tradition about it being written in Egypt. The reason I mention that is simply to say, remember that not all traditions are reliable. People said a lot of stuff, and not all of it was right. The internal evidence, when we read Mark, is that, and some of you picked this up when you told me what the gospel included, was the focus of the gospel is in Galilee. The counter argument to that, as you will have read in Richard Cook's chapter, is that some people think his Palestinian geography is poor. Richard thinks, as I do, that doesn't there are a number of reasons why that might be the case, and it doesn't stop it being the case. I would add that the tradition about Rome and the tradition about Galilee, or the evidence about Galilee, aren't mutually exclusive. Mark's community could have been indigenous to Galilee or Judea, Galilee, I would say, and he and they moved to Rome in the late 60s as part of the uprising, causing a huge diaspora, and certainly by 70 CE. So we could be talking about a gospel community the evangelist community in Galilee in the 60s and in Rome in 70. Mona Hooker, who's an immensely sensible person, she taught me actually 100 years ago, really quite an old commentary, but a really good one if you get secondhand copies lying around. All we can say with certainty is that the gospel was composed somewhere in the Roman Empire, and of course you can say that because it's in Greek. You don't write, it is written for people who speak or hear or listen in Greek. That doesn't tell us very much, does it? But it's consonant with the other stuff. There are lots of uncertainties in biblical studies, alas. So, we ask who wrote it, when, for whom, why, or where, and so on, insofar as these might help us understand their context. 10 to 8, I'd quite like to start the next section, if I may, if you can hang on for about between 5 and 10 minutes for your break. Anybody interrupt now if you say, no, I want the break now, stop it. Are we all right? In that case, I shall just move to this next part, about the case study about Peter, drawing on that first idea that Eusebius says, that Papias says, John the Elder says, that Mark was the interpreter of Peter. So we're going to ask, how is Peter represented in the Gospel of Mark? What does the Gospel say about him? And what do we learn from that? And what do we think that the way he talks about Peter, the way Peter comes across, is consonant with the idea that he is offering us what Peter told him? Doesn't decide the question, but it might contribute to it. I think there's more that we can do with this research question. But I should say first, tradition doesn't claim that Peter's the only witness for what Mark writes. I don't know if you can think of parts of the gospel where Peter wasn't actually present. The obvious ones would be crucifixion. He's not, or at the trial, he's not in the upper room with Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. So, you know, it could still come through Peter that other people, the men aren't present at the crucifixion, of course. They've run away. There are women present at a distance, and so on. The other things we can hope to get out of this, I think, are that I think it will help us with key themes, because of course, Peter is a disciple who acts in certain kinds of ways and is rebuked sometimes. So we might get a sense of the character of discipleship, Peter among others as disciples, and of how Mark puts across his message. The fourth one, and the pedagogical one, is it gives me a chance to demonstrate, if we're going to research a topic like that, how do we go about it? What might we do? What tools can we use? And I don't know if you've been using it to date, but I'd like to recommend to you a free resource developed by Tyndale House called the Step Bible. Has anybody used it? Can you unmute if you have and say, yes, I've been using that? That sounds like it'll be useful to all of you. Good. The other resources like this, if they're free, they might be okay, but they're rarely as sophisticated as this, and they might be using dodgy old stuff because it's, you know, because it's free because it's out of copyright. The other good ones can be expensive. There are some, but this is free. It's a Step is something like scholarly tools for every person or something like that. It's a Tyndale Bible offering to us all and to you. When you can just browse for Step Bible and it'll come up, and you'll see an opening like this. On the right hand side, if you want to, you've got all sorts of hints and indicators of what you can do. So you might choose just to play. There's a tour and there's a user guide, and I've copied the user guide and I'm going to put it onto Moodle for tonight so that you've got a copy there if you want to remember what you can do with this. What I'm doing is screenshotting, shooting whatever I've done, rather than go onto the web and do it and show you, because this freezes what I've done, and you can it might be a good aid memoir if you go back and try similar things yourself. The three buttons at the top are the ones I'm going to explore, or a couple of them. You get the version, and you can just look up a text, and you can do a search. The version shows you that their default is ESV. The next one down, NIV 2011. It hasn't got the NRSV. They're kind of conservative evangelical. That's fine for searches. You're going to be using NRSV for quoting. ESV I have problems with myself. The NIV 2011 is a lot better than the NIV of 1984 and before. They'd made a lot of changes. So if your churches are using the old one, if they can afford it, they need the new one. It's a lot better for all sorts of reasons. The old one was problematic. So you've got some choices, but I'm just going to use the default ESV because for searches it's fine, and it shows you what you'll see when you click on. When you click on the search button, you get you can put in the search word, but you'll also be asked the range. Their default range is the whole of the Bible. That's fine, but you can change it. If you don't want to scroll through lots of text, if it's a common word, you might just go through Mark. I often go straight for Gospels and Acts for something in the Gospels, because it's really useful sometimes to say, oh, look, you know, Mark's using that word, Luke uses this word much more, or something like that. You've got a kind of comparison if you can take things in as you scroll through the examples. If I'm working on Paul, obviously it's really nice to see the whole of the New Testament and whether the Gospels have got the same language. So up to you how much you can find. The search, I've gone here for Gospels and Acts, and I've typed in Peter in English, but I'm going to do the search for the Greek word that lies behind the word Peter when it appears. In this search, it makes not a heap of a difference, and I could have ticked one of the other boxes, but I want to get you into the habit, if you want to use this, of seeing what the Greek word is behind, because it's so easy, and you can do it all in English, even if you've got no Greek at all. Use it, and they've shown me where the Greek word Petros comes up in the ESV translation Peter. I scrolled down through Matthew to get to Mark. If you put the cursor over the word, you get the box at the bottom, a little bit of information, which isn't terribly interesting for Peter, but it's really interesting sometimes for other words. If you don't just put the cursor over the word, but actually click on it, you get a much more of the analysis and some excerpts from lexicons and so forth down on the right hand side. Very easy to get instant information, and also they tell you how often you get it in the Bible, and you can click on those and you can see them all. So because it says Simon, whom he gave the name Peter, we remember that we've got to look for, if we're going to look for what does he say about Peter, we need to look for Simon as well as Peter. The easiest way to do that is just to click on Simon, and you get the word analysis in the right hand side, and that says it happens 74 times. You click on the 74 times and you find them all. You scroll through Matthew and so on. You can write it into the box at the top if you want to, but once you're in the text, it's easier to navigate around like that. I hope you have a play with it yourselves and see.
That looks good.
When you click on Simon, you need to make sure you're getting the right Simon. You know, obviously Simon the Zealot, the Simon the Leper, Simon of Cyrene. I've crossed those out. I'm afraid Step doesn't do that for you. And I put a box around where it is. So we've got in chapter 1, he's called Simon. In chapter 3, he's given the name Peter. And after that, Mark always calls him Peter. And just once, Jesus calls him Simon. And it's a fascinating instance, I think. It's Gethsemane. Jesus finds them sleeping and says to Peter, James and John, says to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Couldn't you watch 1 hour? And commentators say, typically, it's a rebuke. Peter is his name as one of the disciples, and perhaps the rock among the disciples. And here Jesus is sort of rebuking him, said, well, I can't use your disciple name, I'll use your other name because you're not being a faithful disciple. I think it's almost the opposite. I think this is Peter remembering what Jesus called him on that occasion, and it's an intimate indication of these two friends, and Jesus calling him Simon and saying, could you not watch 1 hour? Either way, what it tells us is this is a tradition that comes down from Peter or James or John. If it happened, they're the people who said that, and who better than Peter to remember what Jesus had called him.
Mm.
So we found where Simon Peter is in the whole of the narrative, and I'm going to go for, I could start with Peter saying, you're the Christ, and then getting into trouble. That's where we're going to start in the second half. Let me come out of this whole business. 8 o'clock, just after. We've been joined by our 13th member. Good. The passage that I've chosen, is the central one, where Peter makes the acclamation, the affirmation to Jesus, you are the Messiah. And we're asking 2 things. Does the content of the Gospel of Mark reflect Peter's particular witness? And in order to answer that, as perhaps the more interesting question, we're asking, how is Peter represented in the Gospel of Mark? Here, Peter makes an affirmation. It's clearly an important one. We were told in chapter 1 by the evangelist that Jesus is Messiah, or the Christ, same word. NRSV translates Christos in Greek as Christ if it's associated with the name Jesus, Jesus the Christ. But when it's are you the Christos or you are the Christos, it changes it to Messiah. I can see why they've done it, but it's the same word in Greek. When it's translated Messiah or whether it's translated Christ, it's Christos. Jesus clearly must accept it, but he says, don't talk about this. There's no kind of major pat on the back for Peter. And what he goes on to say is that the Son of Man will suffer and die and be raised. And Peter doesn't like what he said. And Jesus then rebukes Peter and says, you're not looking at this. And really sternly, get behind me, Satan. You're not looking at this in the same way that God looks at this. So it's something about what kind of Messiah. Peter says, you're the Messiah. You are the anointed king whom God has told us who will come to reign in God's kingdom, like David of old. But what Jesus goes on to say is nothing like King David of old. He says that in a third person way of speaking, it's complicated. We can talk about it if we want to. The Son of Man will suffer and die. And Peter says, you can't say this about God's Messiah. That is not what's going to happen. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament scriptures are really, they do not tell you in any clear way that they tell you very clearly God will send the Messiah, his anointed, the king. They don't say, and he will be put to death. Once you know it, you can look back and find hints like the servant songs of Isaiah. But it's not what they expected, and Peter is not expecting that. So much so that he says, don't say that. Just as Paul did when he wanted to stop the Christians claiming Jesus Messiah. He couldn't be the Messiah, he'd been crucified. What Jesus goes on to do is to say that this is the kind of Messiah I am, and therefore, if you want to become my followers, you need to take up your cross and follow me. Presumably, if Peter was saying, you are the Messiah, a king like David, he was expecting to follow a king like David in victory and glory. And he was horribly wrong. Another tool to look at this passage that I'd like you to be using, this one I'm pretty sure you've come across. Lovely fella called Throckmorton took Matthew, Mark and Luke and wrote them down in columns so that we can see how they relate to one another, where Matthew and Luke have used the same material as Mark and so on. The book isn't available in any e-version that I can find through the university or through Hub. It's incredibly cheap to buy second-hand. Some copies for about £4 and so on, because the version I'm using is the RSV, an old one, and the new edition is NRSV. That's on sale too and second-hand, but it's much more expensive. People don't want the old ones, but it's just as good for looking things up. So if you feel you want one in your ministry to come, it could be quite cheap to buy one. As you know, I think what they do is that when they're in parallel, they show it. When there's no parallel, they show it. And the best thing he does is he shows you where the gaps are and tries to arrange the text so that you can see exactly where one of them has edited it with slightly different words. Here, Matthew has a whole section of blessing on Peter and a commission for Peter, which is quite missing from Mark and Luke. We'll look at it in just a second, exactly what he says. By the way, while I'm here and on the page, can you see that in Matthew it says who the men say that the Son of Man is, and so does Mark, and Luke says who do people say that I am? And it's the sort of thing that leads uncautious students or preachers to say, there you are, we can show that, I don't know, they might say Luke includes women, whereas Matthew and Mark don't. You can't do that because it's a stupid translation, or an old one anyway. Here's the the Greek, which you could find obviously through Step Bible. When Matthew and Mark are translated in the RSV, you men say it's anthropoi. That's not androi men, it's anthropoi people. It's a perversity of old-fashioned English that they use men to include women except where it doesn't, and it's just not helpful. One of my beefs with the ESV is it still does it. Here you can see that it's just a choice of words, anthropoi people or ochloi the crowds, and you can't, let's not jump to too much. I think that's why I want you to have a Step Bible, so you could just, if you have an idea like that, you can run the cursor over the word and say, oh, it's the same word, or oh, it doesn't mean that, or it does mean that. There is another tool to get synoptic parallels if you can't access Throckmorton or there aren't enough copies around. You just browse 5 gospel parallels, does it? Be easy to find. It's somebody called Marshall has put it together. It's called 5 Gospels because he has some parts of it, some links which look at the parallels with the Gospel of Thomas, which is a collection of sayings of Jesus, some of them as authentic as the ones in the Gospels. So, one can compare them. I would recommend that you go to the button that I put a red ring round, the 3 synoptics, because that's what we're looking at here. When you click on that, you get Matthew, Mark, and Luke in alongside each other, Mark in the middle. You find a passage that you want here in Mark. I've scrolled down to 8:27, and then you click, and you see there's a purple book and a green book. So the purple book brings Matthew's passage up, and the green book brings Luke's passage up, and then you can compare them. What it doesn't do for you is leave those lovely gaps that Throckmorton leaves to show you where it is. So you have to read it a bit more carefully, and I've just highlighted where that passage is in Matthew and where it would go in Mark, as it were, if one left a gap for it. Here it is written out more clearly. Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, you are Peter. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." So it's quite an acclamation. And while Mark credits Peter with recognizing Jesus' role as Messiah, he absolutely doesn't exalt Peter in the same way that Matthew does here. So we asked, does the content of the Gospel of Mark reflect Peter's particular witness? We'd have to sort of say, well, where has Matthew got this from? Well, it could have been from any of the disciples who were there. Does it mean that Peter didn't tell Mark that story, that Mark chose not to include it, didn't know it? Matthew's got it from a different source. Can't answer any of those questions. The one that we can distinguish is Matthew. Matthew's exaltation of Peter is not matched in Mark. Mark doesn't beef up Peter in that way. Sometimes the arguments from that we can make a sort of negative, he doesn't do that. We can't say he left it out because we don't know that he knew about it. What we should have to do then, of course, is to compare it. Say, is this part of a pattern? And of course, as you know, I'm sure it is. Peter got it badly wrong in in insisting that Jesus must be a Messiah who doesn't suffer and die. So that Jesus rebuked him is really strong. And of course, he carries on blundering along, bless his heart, doesn't he? So shortly after that passage, Peter, James, and John are with Jesus on the mountain, and Elijah and Moses appear. And Peter says at the end, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, shrines, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." And Mark comments, Peter didn't know what to say. They were terrified. And here we have Matthew consciously leaving that out. Matthew used Mark as a source, and when Matthew records that passage, he doesn't say, he chooses not to say that Peter was burbling, whereas which shows us that Mark is is consciously bringing to our attention that Peter is not getting this right. And why should he? Good heavens. Why would anybody be expected to make a good response to what is revealed to them? But it keeps happening. The next place, as we've seen, well, perhaps not the next, but one of the later occasions of a bad failing in Peter is that he, along with James and John, sleep in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in Mark, Jesus comes and addresses Peter by name and even says, "Simon, could you not keep awake 1 hour?" And in Mark, it happens 3 times, comes back and finds it, and Mark says, it's explicit, they did not know what to say to him. So they are left speechless with their own failure. Luke, in that, using Mark as a source, has Jesus return only once. Jesus doesn't address Peter individually. And Luke says, bless him, Luke says Jesus found them sleeping because they were so sad. It's not that they were failing Jesus on this occasion, they were just so filled with grief that of course they fell asleep. Luke is a very compassionate man, I think, most of the time, except to the Pharisees. So a pattern, an explicit pattern of failure, which Matthew and Luke tend to soften or not draw attention to or change. And of course, shortly after that passage, Peter, not named as one by name, but all of them desert Jesus and flee. Now, is this pattern one that we can do more than say, well, that sort of thing happens a lot of times? One of the things we can do is with particular words. Now, I'm not certain that I'm right about this, but I will show you what I mean. Earlier, Peter said, look, we've left everything and followed you. And Jesus has said, anyone who's left house or family for my sake, they will receive 100-fold and eternal life. And that extraordinary motif of reversal, many who are first will be last and the last will be first. That's very strong in Mark, in Luke, in Paul, actually, and let's face it, really clear part of Jesus' proclamation of reversals of power. We'll do more of that in another session. But look at what Peter says: we have left everything and followed you, and all of them deserted him. What you don't know from the English is that's the same word. Aphiemi is to let go or to send away, to give up, to leave. So we have left everything, they say, and later they all leave him. It can also mean forgive. It's actually quite a common word, which is why I'm not sure. Because in forgiveness, if you let go of sins or cancel debts, that's why it's used for forgive when it's coupled with sins. But we can do a step search for, if you click on this verse and left, it says, well, that word is aphiemi. You may notice that Step Bible transliterates the Greek phi, that's ph, as an f, and I do it more traditionally with a ph. Don't worry about it. Use one or the other. I think I'd recommend the traditional way. I don't know if the aphiemi with the f is American influence, but clearly they're both available as scholarly variants. Now, that's where I see that that's the same same word that we get in Mark 14:50, and they all left him and fled. And the ESV has used left rather than deserted him, which helps in that instance. It is a common word, though, may not be a deliberate echo. What happens after they desert him is there's a curious story. You have to kind of say, why did Mark include that? Because it's so apparently odd. It's not odd in terms of what he describes. For somebody to be wearing just it's called a chiton, isn't at all weird. It's just a single kind of sheet, and you clasp it on the shoulder. Well, you put it across the shoulder, one shoulder, and then it's either clasped or tied with a belt. So it's, you know, it's not weird that you slip out of it if you're being grabbed and you're trying to get away. What's weird is that we're told the story. Why? People speculate that you know, Mark puts it in because it's an important story for him, and some people sort of say, oh, perhaps it's him, but we don't think he was first generation eyewitness, the evangelist. I do wonder whether the point of this story is that they've all promised to leave everything and follow Jesus, and at least one of them leaves everything in order not to follow Jesus. And it seems quite a graphic illustration of a reversal of what they promised. But I don't know. It's based on, you know, some patterns and a word or two. But when we do, yes, please.
It's an Old Testament parallel, but I don't know whether it sheds any light on it or not. But of course, Joseph was the prison guard's wife or whatever, wanted to make love to Joseph, and she grabbed his robe and he ran off naked. I think that's something like that.
It's a parallel, and I can see no meaning in it that Mark could be drawing out. Do you see? I mean, and this person was like Joseph. Why? I think that's really why I said it's perfectly normal for clothes to come off like that if you're grabbed. You know, I think it's rather that's a thing that can happen. People do look for reasons like that. You then have to kind of say, and would Mark's readers have made that association? Just as you have to ask me, are you sure they'd have made the association, you know, with leaving everything? Is there enough in the echoes of the gospel? I'll show you a bit later on. I'll show you another leaving of the disciples, which might give substance. The reason I'm doing this is not to persuade you of a particular view, is to say this is the kind of question we ask. This is the kind of research that one can do to hunt around for the patterns and the meaning. My next example is that it is an absolutely explicit echo, and I know it's an intentional one by Mark, whereas I wasn't sure before, because he quotes it a second time. And you know this passage well, that Peter said, even though everybody else leaves you, I won't. And Jesus says, you will deny me 3 times. And he says, even though I must die, I will not deny you. And we know that extraordinary story that he remembers that Jesus says to him before the cock crows twice, you will deny him. So it's you know, Mark quotes what he had said before, so we know he's absolutely bringing that to our attention. Again, you have to say, who does this story come from if it doesn't come from Peter? You know, whether or not Mark listened to Peter, was a disciple of his, I mean, this is a story that's come down to us through Peter's witness, perhaps through other witnesses. If you look in Step Bible on this passage, deny, how often is it used? It's not a frequent word. Then if you can see in the box there, occurs 15 times in the, they say Bible, here it's New Testament because it's Greek. And it's 4 times in Mark, and 3 of them are about this occasion and the promise that he made. But there's another one, and it's that earlier passage that we have. Can you see 8:34? It's that if anyone would come after me, let them deny themselves, pick up their cross and follow me. So it's that same, it follows the rebuke of Peter that disciples must understand better than Peter has done and see what they must do. So Peter is really doing the opposite still of what a disciple should do. The character of discipleship is defined by that word in the earlier passage and associated with following Jesus to death, which is what Peter is avoiding. I've given you a small paragraph here from a very fine article by Mike Higton, which is open access. I recommend it. He's talking about how in reading Mark's Gospel, you are drawn into a kind of discipleship. So it's devotional as well as scholarly. He says, Peter does not weep because he's told a lie, but because he's told the truth. It's true, he does not know the man. He as yet knows nothing. He only begins to learn when the arrest and trial and impending death of his master begin to crucify him too. And finally, to overthrow, and I've paraphrased, Peter's false expectations of following a victorious king. The following to which Jesus calls his disciples consist in dying, following the way of the cross. I love that insight. Peter does not weep because he's told a lie, but because he's told the truth. He doesn't know Jesus yet. Only in following Jesus on the way of the cross does he know him, and of course he does. And Mark's readers would know that Peter did. As well as Mark's readers knowing that, of course, Peter is explicitly restored as someone who will meet with the risen Christ. The young man dressed in white tells the women that he has been raised to new life. Go tell his disciples and Peter. It's really explicit. If one had any doubts that Peter had counted himself out by his tragic action, he is named as one of those to whom Jesus appears. This passage draws us to ask further what we must already have been thinking. Shouldn't we be asking here not just how Peter is represented in the gospel, but how is discipleship represented in the gospel? Because isn't, as it were, Peter showing us something about how people are and are not responding to the claims of discipleship in this gospel? And I raise it now because of how this passage goes on and ends the gospel. The women went out. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, just as with Peter, we know that these women don't finish in this position of silence and fear. For one thing, how would we know this story if they hadn't spoken out in the end, and they would have been known to in the later communities as witnesses to the resurrection? But the point is, it's not only Peter who fails in courage and commitment initially. So what's Mark saying about discipleship? This pattern goes beyond Peter. It's there in Peter. Can you see the parallel between them saying nothing because they're afraid, Peter not knowing what to say, for they were terrified, the three of them were terrified? I don't know how well you know other passages, but you could look up fear or afraid and see what lies behind that. And you'll probably come across things like this in the calming of the sea. Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? Or to Jairus, when his daughter is dying or dead, do not fear, only believe. That's the same word as faith, have faith. So somehow being fearful is the opposite of believing. And I think Mark's first readers were being told by Jesus and by Mark, you need to take courageous action. And the disciples are repeatedly being told that and not understanding and not being faithful, but being fearful throughout. We spoke at the beginning that this is quite a dark gospel, didn't we? They are fearful and doubting, and it's even a path that Jesus treads before us, isn't it? That is an extraordinary quotation from the Psalms that Jesus is said to say from the cross, even remembered in Mark's dialect, and that's the Hebrew is Eli, Eli, and Matthew tidies it up and puts it into proper Hebrew. But Eloi, Eloi is an Aramaic accent on that passage shared by Mark and by Jesus. It's the way of the cross to take one through failure to victory. It's not a glorious road to victory in Mark. And he shaped his gospel really structurally to show this. Please don't try to read this tiny print, but what I've tried to show you by taking chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10 is that through those key sort of central passages where Jesus is teaching his disciples on the way to Jerusalem, on the way to his death, he teaches them that the Son of Man must suffer and be killed and be raised. And the first one is followed by Peter saying, you shouldn't say that, and being rebuked. The second one is followed by the bit that I've underlined in blue. They didn't understand, they were afraid. Exactly that same motif. And the third one, getting a bit more detailed, the Son of Man will suffer and die. And that's followed by John and James saying, can we have seats beside you in glory? And Jesus says, can you be baptized with the suffering with which I am to be baptized? It's that same message each time, and they kind of don't get it. So, is that a terribly difficult ending, or is it a perfectly crafted ending for Mark's message? Because the reader surely is supposed to respond by saying, well, the disciples have been doing this all the way through, and that clearly isn't what Jesus is wanting. Jesus is saying, do not be afraid, but have faith. And that's what I should do as a reader of this and as a disciple, learning about how the disciples acted. Some people think that's too sort of postmodern, that Mark wouldn't leave you hanging like that and making you, as it were, create the ending of the gospel. But he's been doing it all the way through, giving you a very difficult parable or an extraordinary deed of power or miracle, and letting you say, so what are you going to do about that? It's the way he writes. The oldest manuscripts end there. Readers in all the centuries before us have struggled with this ending, and some of them still do. I mean, Tom Wright is the latest of people to say, surely we've lost the ending of Mark. Mark definitely didn't mean to end there, and we've lost the ending that Mark clearly actually wrote. But all I can say to you is that all the oldest manuscripts end at 16:8. The majority of the manuscripts, that's not the earliest ones, but the majority of the manuscripts have 9 to 20. One of the reasons it gets put in differently from the way the NRSV puts it is because King James has a principle of going by the majority rather than the oldest of our manuscripts. It's called the Textus Receptus. The ones that, even that majority of manuscripts which have 9 to 20, a lot of them mark in the margin, not sure about this bit, or doubtful of origin, or and so forth. No problem, it's part of scripture, it's just not part of Mark. Even the people who even the endings that are added there, as it were, aren't claiming to be part of the original Markan Gospel. I think it's a wonderful ending, and I find that same kind of way that Mark addresses me right through the text and addresses his first readers. What I hope you are seeing in making this form of inquiry, and I've done some word searches and compared some passages and looked at some ideas, and I'm not sure about all of them, is that the whole of Mark's message will appear through the parts, and we'll only really understand the part that we're looking at, so this episode with Peter in it, if we've understood, well, isn't that the way that Mark treats discipleship in the whole? And we have to do exegesis of a passage and a sermon on a passage by saying, well, within the whole gospel, this is how I can see that it has a particular meaning. We might not share the whole of that with our congregations, poor things, when we give it in a sermon, but we need to have done that work. So I do think it might help us to identify key themes, the character of discipleship, and how Mark puts his message across, and we get to know how does Mark say, why does he do that? How is he putting that? Why has he included that, and so on. Obviously, it's given me a chance to demonstrate some tools of this kind of research, and to show that I'm sure about some things, I'm not so sure about others. What about, does it help us evaluate that tradition that Mark recorded Peter's witness? I think what it tells us, it's possible and fascinating because it means that that characterization of failure, initial failure, and apart from a promise at the end of the gospel, that's all we know of Peter's record within the text. But that picture could come from Peter himself, which means that is, as it were, it's Peter's gospel too, as well as Mark's. Completely indeterminate on that. In terms of preaching, I don't think it helps to know that or not know it. In terms of understanding what's the message of the passage and what these believers meant when they reflected on the lives of the disciples who had preceded them and what had happened and how they should respond following them, and recognizing that there had been failure and what that means in the Christian story, I think those things are terribly important for our theological understanding and our reading of the gospel. We could do a little bit more of the themes of Mark's gospel and the structure, although we've started to do that, I think, in looking at where Peter appears. The point is that in all of these things, Mark has redacted, is the word we use, it means edited, whatever the traditions he has heard or read, wherever they come from, and that selection and arrangement of those units of tradition, you'll sometimes hear them or read them called pericope, those units of episodes, must be key to his purpose and to the first readership. I would like to do something on sort of theological themes. And I'm going to ask you a question. This is a pretty random, I think, isn't it? Word cloud. I think it's meant to be based on sort of New Testament. And these words may indeed turn up a certain number of times. I don't think it tells you what the message of the New Testament is. And that's what I'd like you to tell me. I've asked you some impossible questions this evening. If I said to you, and I'm going to come out of the slides in a sec, well, you've read large parts of the New Testament, if not all of it. What is the message of the whole of the New Testament? If you had to sort of put down a few phrases and say, well, the New Testament is about this, just like you did it for Mark and the Gospel. But let me ask you, beyond that, what's the message of the New Testament? I'm not going to ask you to write it unless you want to. I'm going to see if anybody wants to say, well, one of the things the New Testament is about fairly centrally is this. So would anybody come up with anything? Anybody feeling bold? The New Testament is about. I know it's an impossible question, or there's lots of answers one might give. What appeals to you as a central idea, motif, question, issue?
Can I come in just for a second? It was when I was doing that little bit of prep, and it was trying to think. Oh, it was a John Golden Gaze video when he said about the what's the value of the New Testament? Is there any value in the New Testament? And unbelievably, I hadn't actually thought about this. You know, do we need the New Testament? And yes, because it's when the major theological difference between the Old and the New is resurrection, heaven and hell, and the change in God's mission. Whereas instead of the Palestinian Jews having their law to attract people, they changed that around. When you were talking earlier about kosher food and so on and so forth, took that away and sent people out instead. So the New Testament is for everybody.
Of course, the promise to Abraham is for all nations. But
yes.
So, you know, the seeds are always there, aren't they? It's not a rejection of the old, it's a fulfillment of the old and the new. Nice. So something about fulfilling, could I say it's fulfilling the promises of the Old Testament is one of the things it's showing. And of course, they're about God's promises to set free and rule over God's people. who God's people are is certainly extended, so that it's not just the people of God, the nation, the Jews, but the nations, the Gentiles, who are the other peoples, who are also God's peoples. Yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial. I'm always fascinated by the idea we need the New Testament, because of course I'm a big fan of Paul, and he didn't have the New Testament. He had the proclamation about Jesus' death and resurrection, and built Christian theology on it, really. And it's hugely about that fulfillment. Perhaps if I press you on that, how are God's promises fulfilled? Does the New Testament tell us?
That part of one of the things about the Old Testament that strikes me is that it seems it's almost like a single thread of narrative. You know, there's the starting, and then there's this hope for sort of, middle bit, and then you kind of peak with David, and then it all just goes wrong after that. It all goes to pot. But there's almost like a sense that the time is a line. But then you look at the New Testament, and it's almost like it goes poof, because it's the idea that you've got the singularity of Jesus' death and resurrection, but time doesn't go on in a line from there. It goes out like a star. People go out. There's not a linear. It's a going out to different peoples, to different places. It's the picking up and the carrying of the message. And in a way, because one of the phrases that comes back to me is, let him who has ears to hear. Do you know what I mean? And
you're reading an old-fashioned translation, but okay, yeah.
Yeah, it becomes, but do you know what I mean? It becomes that. Last Sunday, I literally preached on the Mark 8 passage and Peter saying, "You are the Messiah," and I started off with, but part of the problem is that Peter's seeing what he wants to see. So yeah. You've got the healing of the guy,
what he's expecting too.
Yes.
The Old Testament doesn't tell you you're going to get a crucified Messiah.
Yeah,
that was how the heck they got their heads around that.
Where they get that
is a fascinating business. Good. Yeah, I think one of the posh names for that sort of linear thing in Old Testament scholarship is salvation history. The idea that you can see that salvation is there's a sense, isn't there, in which the New Testament is a salvation moment. Because it's an eternal moment, because God's promises not just are going to be fulfilled, but are being fulfilled. It's actually happening, that kind of eternal now, so that Jesus' resurrection is the beginning of the new life. In Jesus, believers have new life now. We'll find this very strongly in John's Gospel, I think. The names that we use for the things we're talking about are eschatology and Christology, aren't they? So the center is that eschatological fulfillment, the end time, and end is the destination, not just the goal, not just finality. That is what God has been bringing us, the world, his people, and I guess the third element is precisely that, the people of God. In Paul, we can see that coming out in all sorts of ethics and ecclesial behavior. In the Gospels, I think we call it discipleship. So if I can share me what's this again? How do I do that? Down there, share screen. That one. Is that showing all right again?
Yep.
Yeah.
Good. Get rid of my random cloud. Doesn't really help. Yours are better. This is what I went for. I'm not saying this is what you should have said. I'm saying it seems to me that the whole of the New Testament is about eschatology, God's promises to liberate and rule his people. They will be fulfilled and are being fulfilled. It's the already but not yet of that fulfillment. Right from Jesus' proclamation, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Like I say, it's so near that its effects are already being felt. It happens right from the beginning. Christology, that Jesus is God's anointed, the King Messiah, who will rule in God's kingdom, eschatological kingdom, and he's put to death on a cross and raised to new life. That's the extraordinary thing which the Old Testament isn't at all clear about until what it was tending to. And the discipleship, that's connected to both of those things. We're called to repent, to believe, to follow Jesus, and are remade in Christ. So are the new people of God in Christ. It does hang together awfully well. And of course, this is really me mediating Paul's theology, really, in this. But it is the pattern of the New Testament. If you're happy, as it were, for me to say, surely we're looking for eschatology, Christology, discipleship, obviously what we can do is look for that in Mark, and think that through the narrative, the beginning, the middle, and the end, and you all talked about that at the beginning, you say it's done through story. Mark tells you this, and that's how he puts his message across. The themes are developed. So we have his particular summary of Jesus' teaching. The time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God has come near, repent. The Christology that Peter finds so difficult, the Son of Man will suffer and be killed and be raised. And that discipleship follows in that pattern. Let them deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. And that I've suggested that what we have at the end of the gospel is the message of 536 in the cliffhanger of what are these women going to do? What am I going to do? As I read it, do not fear, only believe. We could sort of see that in the shape, but what I've done is to go to a fairly standard pattern of how we think the structure of Mark's gospel works, and show you how those different elements play some kind of role in the beginning and the middle and the end. If you just look at that grid and the sections, this is the sort of thing you find in most commentaries in their sort of contents page. You can see how they divided it up, and if they've done it theologically and rationally, you can come to some common mind. Lots of us think that Mark is structured in 6 readable segments, and it was designed for public delivery, oral reception, so it probably would have had sort of blocks, and he does arrange sort of certain cliffhangers. So 3:6 is that his opponents got together and discussed how they could destroy Jesus. That's got a lovely kind of EastEnders end to it before the next section begins. Authority following opposition in the beginning. Then there's parables, which and miracles, where something is revealed and something is still hidden. The episodes around the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking of the water, where Jesus is still saying, do you not yet understand, repeatedly. And then their eyes beginning to open. So Peter does say you're the Messiah, but he doesn't understand what that means still. So eyes beginning to open, but not seeing clearly. And then Jerusalem, and then the Passion. Lots of us think it's got some kind of movement like that, and I think it helps to see how the whole appears through the parts in the whole. The other strategy we have is to sort of look at structure in particular sections, and maybe the obvious one to go for us is the opening of the gospel, because this is a bit that doesn't just tell us a story. I mean, it does, but it's actually a series of proclamations, isn't it? We start the gospel by learning a number of key things about Jesus and how he will fulfill God's promises, the end times. The first proclamation is by the narrator. It's the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, and some manuscripts have Son of God, some don't have it. Doesn't matter whether they have it or not, because it's clearly what Mark then goes on to say in verse 11. Then it's the proclamation by Scripture about Jesus, Isaiah, which actually Isaiah and a bit of Malachi, isn't it, or something? But Mark's working orally and says it's Isaiah. Then John the Baptist says, He's more powerful than I and will baptize you with the Spirit. Talk about that in a second. And a voice came from heaven, that is God, making a proclamation about Jesus. What do they say about Jesus? Well, they say that he is the Messiah, Christos, Son of God, or King, like David. And the voice from heaven says exactly what God's voice says in the Psalms about David. You are my son. The psalm goes on, today I have begotten you, the adoption of the king as king and agent of God. The descent of the Spirit is certainly messianic there, because it's part of the New Testament prophecy that the Messiah will be the one on whom the Spirit rests permanently. So that's part of Old Testament fulfillment and the Christological understanding of Jesus' role. And it's eschatological, isn't it? It's going to be the way of the Lord. And the thing I said I'd come back to, if Jesus is going to baptize with the Holy Spirit, then he is an agent of the end times. Because do you remember that the prophecy in Joel? You'll know it from Acts. In those days, says the Lord, I will pour out my Spirit. In the end times, all God's people will be filled with the Spirit, or washed in the Spirit, empowered by the Spirit, which is what John the Baptist says will be Jesus' role. So Christology and eschatology are proclaimed about Jesus. You're set up by Mark's prologue, much more than I think people recognize, to understand what his message is going to be about. When we get to the other Gospels, and of course John's prologue, we'll see that John does exactly that, sets up at the beginning what you need to know about Jesus. And Matthew and Luke do it differently. So we'll compare those. And what's it go on to say? Have I got time? Yes, I got that 5 minutes. It goes on to summarize that Jesus proclamation, which sort of sits between those acclamations and what Jesus then goes on to do. And we see Jesus with his actions following. And it begins with calling disciples, follow me, and they leave their nets and follow him. Anybody want to have a guess what that word they left is? It's the Greek word that we've seen before. This is why I've got a bit of a thing about it. I think it's a pattern. This is what Peter refers to. He says, we have left everything to follow you. And it's what Mark told us. They leave their nets, and the others leave their father with the hired men to follow him. It's the pattern of discipleship to do that. Another word one could hover over in step fruitfully is repent. Can you see down in their word analysis? It means the change of mind that also means changing your life, changing your actions as well as your thoughts. And can you see, now this is where, how brilliant is Mark as a storyteller, as a redactor of this material, as a theologian. He tells you Jesus' proclamation is the kingdom of God has come near. What should you do? You should change your life. Jesus toddled along, called some people, and they changed their lives. That, you know, they're enacting, as it were, what Jesus proclaims in what follows. I really don't think that's an accident. I don't think I'm making this up. I think this is part of Mark's conscious or unconscious genius in how he puts this message across and shows how Jesus' message was responded to. One of you said that right at the beginning. It shows us how people responded to Jesus' message. And of course, we learn from that. I could do more. I could go on to the next section and how that sets up all sorts of things, like the demons recognizing that he's come to destroy them and so on, because God's kingdom is near. But my point is, throughout all of this material, Mark has selected and arranged, and the word we use is redacted, whatever traditions he has heard or read. And it's the narrative, as you said at the beginning, one of you, carries the message. And the themes are focused on things and developed almost certainly because they are going to match something that Mark thinks is relevant to the network of congregations, if that's what it was, in which he found himself and where he was working. I would like to add a short final section on resources. I will do something a lot more with resources as we go along, and especially when we get to the essays, obviously. And I'm happy to help any of you as we go along. And I'm not assuming that you're going to read lots of things, but I think if we're talking about the Gospels, we're not just talking about this module, are we? We're talking about setting you up so that you can resource yourself for discipleship and preaching on these texts. So I'm saying, here's the kind of thing that's available to you. Very briefly. Obviously, I'm going to put these slides up as I do it as PDFs so that you don't have to wade through lots of stuff. I kind of give you the whole of them, but cutting out the middle bits, cutting out the slides which just have 1 or 2 sentences on. The first part is about authorship and all that stuff. And the second one is about Peter in the Gospel of Mark, which includes Step Bible stuff. And the third one will be what we've just done and these resources. I put a fourth one up, which is I've pinched it off the Step Bible site, which is their user introduction, in case you want to use that rather than using, the My Steer or getting on with it yourself. The things I've referred to here are Step Bible, and that's easy to find. 5 Gospel Parallels, easy to find. Throckmorton, I find it incredibly helpful to have somebody who's cut it out. And like I say, the cheap RSV ones will work just as well for you finding the material and then, studying it in the version that you want. Showed you an article by Mike Hickton, which is a good read, and I quoted from one of my favorite commentaries, but it's not available to you other than hard copy in the university library, should you be able to have access to that. So I must look at e-resources for you, obviously. I went to the hub first, and I put in Gospel and Mark. Not a lot, but I think what's there is, some of it is really good for you, I think. Can you see the Henderson, Christology and Discipleship in the Gospel of Mark picks up some of the things we were doing. Marcus Story, the 2012 one, David Rhodes, I think could be good. There is a commentary, but can you see the date? That is almost as old as I am. Now, Cranfield is fabulous, but old. So, scholarship didn't stop there, and things have changed as well as the enduring things which he has to tell us as well. So don't make that your only one. I'll come back to Telford. The hub is very short on commentaries, partly because commentaries not many of them have got into ebooks yet, but they're getting there. There's a single volume one, I'm sure you found, the Oxford Bible Commentary, and there are good but obviously necessarily short commentaries on all of the Gospels, which are good starting places by all means. You'll probably want Eric Franklin on Luke when you think about your essay. A reminder that you reference the author, not the editor, when you quote. So it would be Franklin, 2007, page something, with a reference in your bibliography. The Telford, at the bottom of the list there on the hub, is part of a series. They're really good. I bring them to your attention, partly because they're all there on the hub. And they're short, and I think short books are extremely helpful. They're digests of what's he banging on about, what is his themes, where does that come out. So we haven't got commentary, detailed commentary on a lot of passages, but of course that would lead you back to those passages perhaps and commentaries on them. So I think really good. And Gospel of Luke is Joel Green, who is particularly good. So I think that would be definitely one for your essays later. And if you're preaching on other Gospels in the meantime, good places for you to look. The University of Chester Library, if you go through the library search, is really, well, obviously we've got loads of commentaries on the shelves if you can use them. There are increasingly books obviously available as ebooks, which you can access straight away through the catalogue. And what I've done, and I will try to do each time, is to find you something that's decent. For Mark, Eugene Boring's Mark, a commentary, is really good. Doesn't quite lose my adherence to Morna Hooker's, but I mean, he uses her as well. It's really good stuff. I think I quoted from him as I was talking earlier this evening. You get the full text online through the catalogue. While you're a member of the university, that's obviously available to you. I probably don't need to say to you, but obviously there are commentaries available online for free. The reason they're free is they're out of copyright, and that means they're really old, unless you've got a license for it, like you do for the ones through the university. They may be fine in all sorts of ways, and perhaps devotionally, but the scholarship is kind of too old for your essays, and in some measure too old for your sermons. And I'm sure you've been told that before. I suppose I'm saying, don't keep using Matthew Henry. Do have a look around. There's other people been writing. Lovely Matthew Henry, a Chester boy. What I would like you to do before next time is to read Matthew. If you're better reading it in chunks than in a whole thing, I've given you 4 sections which it could be said to fall into in a rational kind of way. Can you see? It's rather small print, but you'll see it on Moodle. 1 to 4, 4 to 11, 11 to 16, 16 to 28. The chapters and verses that we get, of course, are not authorial. They're very late. Chapters 12th century, verses 16th century. They've just been put in to help us find the bits we're talking about. And they're not always right about the divisions that the Gospels fall into. I obviously like you to read Richard Cook. I think he's very readable and certainly very good. And it means that I can focus on particular things, which is great for me. And I've suggested this time some questions you could bring to your reading of Matthew if you want some prompts to sort of start thinking about. But you've probably got the idea from today of the kind of thing I might do: structure, themes, what's he saying about Jesus, and so on, motifs. If you get a chance to check out the Step Bible online, I think it'd be great that by the time you come to do your essay, you've had a few goes at it and have started finding it useful. And of course, tell me if you're not finding it, you'd like some guidance on it, and maybe I can do that. I think that's all for today. I stop sharing. It's 1:15. We mustn't take very long. Is there anything I should clarify, help with, say I didn't mean that? Anything that would be good to ask any questions about? Do you know what you might be thinking about when you read Matthew now? You're kind of sort of thinking, okay, we were asking that kind of question. What's going on? Why is he saying it that way? That's different from the way Mark puts it. If you can get hold of gospel parallels, you might sometimes look across and say, where's that in Mark? But obviously that would be laborious. I'd like you most of all to get a sense of Matthew, beginning, middle, end.
Can I ask one question?
Yes,
because it relates to the use of the Richard Cook book, because each chapter on the gospel is preceded by a chapter. So in the case of Mark, it's preceded by a chapter on Peter, and Matthew's preceded by a chapter on James. Is it useful does it add much to our understanding to have read those chapters alongside them?
It's all good stuff. You don't need to have done so in order to, and if there are things that I would like you to know about, I'm in a sense going to do that. One of the things I'll be doing with Matthew is saying this looks very much like a Jerusalem church tradition, with adherence to Torah, Jerusalem church led by James, brother of Jesus. So in a sense, I'll be doing that. So you won't miss out on it. But if you've got a lot of time to read, it's good stuff. Lots of stuff he does. But you can definitely read a chapter at a time, just the one that we're focusing on, and get what you need from which. I think it must be quite a good teacher. It's good stuff, I think.
It's a good read.
Good. I'm going to shut up and let people pray for us.
I think I've forgotten to stop the recording, so we'll just have a look at that. Okay.